Hello and welcome to the channel and welcome to another LSB Film podcast. Today's episode wasn't an easy episode to record. This is not a light conversation and nor should it be. Today we speak about truth, injustice and a scandal that has spanned nearly 25 years. I am joined by Anne Dixon, mother of Elizabeth Dixon, and her close friend and advocate Victoria Rixon, who you all know. Together we remember Elizabeth, a precious daughter born in the year 2000 whose life was cut short before her first birthday. Elizabeth's death was not fate, not nature, not unavoidable. It was the result of catastrophic failings, unlawful treatment and a systemic cover-up that involved some of the most powerful institutions in the British healthcare system and beyond. Her voice was silenced at just 11 months old, but her truth cannot and will not be denied. Anne and Graham Dixon, Elizabeth's parents, have fought tirelessly and relentlessly for justice, not only for their daughter, but for the countless other families whose lives have been shattered by negligence, deception, obstruction, and at the very highest levels within the NHS Trusts, GMC, NMC, CQC, the Department of Health, NHS England, and associated bodies. This case is far bigger than one family's grief. It represents one of the most significant scandals in the history of the NHS, implicating more than 95 individuals and exposing a culture of cover-up over candour, reputation over responsibility, and silence over truth. Today we give space to Elizabeth's story, not just to honour her memory, but to demand what should never have had to have been demanded: accountability, transparency, and reform. This is not just a story about what happened in the past, it's a warning for the present and a call for change in the future. So let's begin.
Are you concerned about all this corruption being rebranded as conspiracy theory? Well, don't you worry. Sit back and relax and join in the conversation with today's guest. Welcome to another LSB Film Productions podcast with your host, Chris Brooks.
So welcome to the show, both of you lovely ladies. Victoria, you're just going to give a quick overview of what this is about, and then the lovely Anne is going to take over.
Yes, thanks, Chris, for having us. So Anne Dixon is the mother of Elizabeth Dixon, and Graham is Elizabeth's father. And Anne and Graham are here with me in Plymouth, and they've been telling me their story over the last 8 weeks. For those of you who don't know, I'm a whistleblowing midwife, big cover-ups, and I've exposed more after leaving than when I was actually there. Sorry, you're losing me because of that blurring, I can see it. So Anne has a story of her daughter. It's not a story, it's a horror story, where Anne has said to me that they murdered her daughter 25 years ago and they covered it up, and she didn't become aware of the cover-up for 11 years when she started getting and gathering all the evidence. Anne is like a private investigator. She hasn't stopped on her quest for truth. And my concern is that lots of the people that Anne disclosed to me, I'm familiar myself, as I've even written about one of them in one of my essays at university. And these people are in power today in these positions of real power of people's lives. Mm-hmm. And we're about to go into a maternity inquiries of 14 hospitals under the Amos inquiry. And some of these people are named and involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. My life has been hell for almost 25 years. Ever since I made the mistake of becoming pregnant and going onto the NHS. I initially found out I was pregnant with my first child, and I was in a lot of pain within 24 hours, and I thought I had appendicitis. So I went up to our then local hospital, and they ruled out appendicitis. But having found out I was pregnant, they asked me to return the following morning to have an internal early pregnancy scan to check my baby wasn't actually growing in the fallopian tube, was actually growing where my baby should be growing. And in fact, my baby was fine. It wasn't an ectopic pregnancy. A report got published in 2020 that said I went to the hospital and asked for a scan. The hospital was diligent, because if you have an ectopic pregnancy, you can actually, apart from losing the baby, you can lose your fallopian tube, and sometimes women lose their lives. They were fantastic. We moved house, but I wanted to remain under that hospital. But the hospital persuaded me, or the midwives in the community, that I should transfer my care to Friendly Park Hospital. It has ruined my life. And at this juncture, I just want to say, just because you work in healthcare, or because you're a parent, or because you've lost a child, that doesn't make you altruistic and honest. It just means you work in healthcare, you're a parent, or you lost a child. And that is part of the problem. So I transferred my care to Frimley Park, and I had some scans which showed my baby was small for days. I then got transferred under a consultant called Jane Coburn. She is a staunch feminist. She belonged to some organisation of obstetric feminists, and also she had a very keen interest in psychology of women, of mothers and pregnancies, too keen an interest that unfortunately has clouded what she did with me. So anyway, I went for a checkup. I'd been busy all day preparing for a funeral the next day of my father-in-law. I went for a checkup on a Thursday afternoon, and when I sat down and was relaxed, my baby started moving around inside me, having a party inside me, one was described it as. And they wanted to do a fetal heart monitoring, but she was tiny and she was moving around and moving away from the beams they use to detect the heart and record it. So they tried to do another one, and she was still moving around a lot. So the midwife said, let's do one at 6 o'clock, unless you want to get off, because I know you've got things to do. And I agreed to have one at 6 o'clock. Now, if my baby had been in danger, if my baby had been hypoxic or anemic, they would never stop that tracing.
Correct.
I had a perfect trace for 48 minutes. And the report by Bill Kirkup says they can't find that trace. Well, I had a copy of it at my house, and they scanned that in my dining room. And I have a copy of the scan they made, because we kept a backup of everything they scanned in case they did do a cover-up. And the original trace is still available in Friendly Park Hospital. So a junior doctor misunderstood why I was going to be retraced at 6 o'clock. And that's where it all went wrong. I did have what they call some sinusoidal tracing, where the pattern of the baby's heart was slightly different. But if that stays different, then you've got an issue. But if it reverts to normal again, it's fine. And that's what was happening with my daughter. And Martin Pittman told me she was probably sucking her thumb, and that was going on.
Just explain who these people. So
Martin Pittman was a consultant obstetrician who whistleblew in Winchester. And we were up the road, up the M3 at Frimley Park. And I was concerned that the junior doctor had misunderstood, because he said, you've got to have your baby now. And I was thinking, well, she was fine earlier on. I got told I could go off and get on with what I needed to do. So I asked him to fax the traces to my obstetrician, who hadn't been listening anyway to me in the pregnancy. And he said that he had, and that she'd ordered the baby be born. Now, she did order my baby be born early, but she never saw those traces. And Martin Pittman said, if she was contactable to make a decision over the phone, she should have come in and looked at the traces. And he said any experienced consultant would never have delivered my baby. There was no need. She wasn't hypoxic. She wasn't anemic. She wasn't compromised. And she shouldn't have been delivered. However, Jane Coburn, being the person she was, and she was very arrogant, decided over the phone my baby needs to be born. I still felt concerned. They called in an on-call consultant called Gareth Benyon. He did not look at the traces. In my notes, he wrote, asked to see. They had written asked to see, which was me asking to see him because I still felt something was wrong. That's been twisted in Bill Kirkup's report to he asked to see the traces. So instead, he was obviously miffed at being called in late at night, and he he said if I didn't sign and consent to the delivery, he would take me to court in the morning. I was so scared I was making the wrong decision, that something awful would happen. I made Graham, my husband, sign my consent form. It didn't mean anything, but I wanted him to take part responsibility for a
So
decision.
essentially terrorising you into a decision.
Terrorise. The NHS lawyers have said that because Graham signed the consent as well as me, it showed very clearly that we were both in agreement this was the right thing to do. It wasn't that I'd actually told the solicitor why he signed it, because I felt it was wrong. So anyway, my baby was born, and then they began a charade of pretending that she'd come out completely undamaged because they'd got us there in the nick of time and performed a miracle. So, but in fact, they hadn't. She didn't need to be delivered. But once she was delivered, they were just concentrating on pretending this. And everybody was. There was a care plan that was written up the night she was born, which was a Thursday, to check her blood pressure with cares. She had very high blood pressure at birth, to check her blood pressure with cares and report any deviation from normal baseline. There was a note by a paediatrician who consultant to check her blood pressure, and it wasn't done. It wasn't done for, she was born late on the 14th. It wasn't done until 3:30 on the 18th of December. Nurses were signing for following the care plan on each shift, apart from the shift where they did actually check it. And it was now almost double what it had been at birth. And she'd become floppy. She'd been crying with this high-pitched cry, and the people had been ignoring my concerns. And she stopped crying. I never heard her cry again. And they then swept that under the carpet. They covered up what they'd done at the birth. They covered up the negligence after the birth. I was gaslit. I was referred to a psychiatrist by Jane Coburn. And I was labelled, over-anxious. I was given antidepressants. And they didn't do anything about the blood pressure, even though they knew it was high. And they left Elizabeth like that from the 18th of December to the 27th of December, all through Christmas. They knew what they'd done because one doctor, and one doctor only, wrote these notes that my daughter had a bulging fontanelle and a problem with her blood pressure. When she'd collapsed into this disabled baby, they'd done an ultrasound of her brain. And in order to do it, you have to put the probe on what's called the fontanelle, the soft spot. And he'd seen it was bulging. Well, that should have been depressed. It was bulging because her high blood pressure was causing pressure in her brain. And then the brain, it bulges and is forced down on the brainstem. All her disability can be linked with the damage to the brainstem, but it was all covered up. And they didn't do anything about the blood pressure. On the 27th of December, they told her she had high blood pressure as if she'd never had it before. And then they manipulated her abdomen and they found something in her abdomen. It was clearly visible on pregnancy scans and it should have been looked into, but it hadn't been. It was called a non-fatal neuroblastoma. It's a childhood cancer, childhood tumour, but she had a good prognosis of it, a non-fatal infantile form, but the side effect can be high blood pressure. But now she is profoundly disabled. So they sent her to Great Ormond Street and they sent a summary, and Great Ormond Street never asked for the medical records. And the summary made no mention of what happened on the 18th of December. The summary said that in fact she'd been born because of fetal distress and swallowing meconium, which is false and didn't happen. And basically said or made out she was born disabled. So and that's the truth, and that's why they never sent the medical records. But in Great Ormond Street, they didn't ask for those records ever. The entire time she was there for 10 months to the day in Great Ormond Street. They never asked for them. We arrived in Great Ormond Street. They had brought her blood pressure down. They plummeted her blood pressure, and I tried to ask them what had happened to her. Why wasn't she crying anymore? Why wasn't she moving? But they believed the summary they had that she'd never being able-bodied, and I got referred to a children's psychiatrist at Great Ormond Street, And then I got prescribed more antidepressants. And because they didn't have the facts, the truth, the records, or a true summary, they based all her prognosis and her care on the summary that wasn't true. So they said they weren't going to treat the neuroblastoma. There was no need. But she was breath holding by then from the damage in her brain. So then they decided, oh, maybe the breath holding's caused because the tumour's getting in the way of the diaphragm.
How
So
old
they
was she
started.
at this point?
She was 4 weeks old. She was 36 weeks gestation.
How much does she weigh again?
Well, she was born at £2.13 ounces. And then they started giving her chemotherapy at 36 weeks gestation because they were unaware that she'd suffered a brain injury and that the reason she was breath holding was down to the damage to her brainstem. So they gave her several courses of chemotherapy, but she continued to breath hold. So then they said, oh, well, let's give her a tracheotomy, my little baby. And they said that they thought that would sort it out. So then we were forced to consent to that. Graham had said no. By this time, we had a social worker, which I thought was supporting me, but I now know was there because they seemed to think us not wanting these things to happen, we were somehow a threat to our child. So they gave her the tracheotomy and breath holding continued.
So let's just intercept there. The hospital delivered care based on a misdiagnosis that was withheld from the original hospital. They gave chemotherapy because of the breath holding and said it would cure it, which it didn't. And then so the chemotherapy wasn't needed. And Anne didn't really consent to that because she didn't understand.
Well, I didn't have the facts.
And then they gave her a tracheotomy because of the breath holding. And then it made no difference to the breath holding. So she had all this mutilation on her and nothing changed.
Nothing changed.
Why did they deliver the baby really early in the first place?
Because the junior doctor had misunderstood why I was having another trace at 6 o'clock. I'd been in what they call the day assessment unit, although in the report it's changed to delivery assessment unit, to hide the bad handover between antenatal and maternity. I was only going to maternity because my baby was jumping around inside me. She was perfectly fine, moving like, kicking all the time. And when that happens, and the baby's moving around so much, if it's a small baby, they can't pick up all the heartbeats because they rely on ultrasound, don't they? An ultrasound beam. And my little girl was much smaller than they claimed she was. And, in fact, I don't think they use CTGs in this way anymore because of that, because it's not really very good when you've got an early stage of pregnancy or a preterm baby. So in Great Orme Street, things went on and we were trapped in intensive care. It had got to June and we've been there since December. And we've been told, it's not like you think. She's going to be riding a tricycle at 3, the neurologist said. And she wasn't doing anything at all. And we felt that they were abusing her and that she wasn't able to tell them. So we wrote to the chief executive and the medical director. Name them. Jane Collins. She's the same person.
Sorry, what was that?
Jane
Collins.
Jane
Collins. Okay.
She was the chief executive and the medical director in the same role at that moment. Well, she was a children's neurologist. She'd been working with the neurologist that said our daughter would be riding a tricycle at 3. So she got a second opinion from another neurologist in the same team who she'd been working with previously. And she got an opinion from someone she trained under at Guy's and St Thomas's. And they both admitted that, she hadn't developed at all. But they both saw the MRIs, so they must have seen what had happened, that her brainstem had been squashed and altered. But either way, genetic department decided my daughter had some unknown genetic condition, which was unnamed, and that we had a risk of having another child like her. But it wasn't true at all. She'd suffered a brain injury at 4 days old. So as soon as they labelled her profoundly disabled, they couldn't wait to get rid of her from intensive care. I was told by a ward sister they'd wasted £2,000 a day on my daughter. and nothing had been achieved. So she still had the tracheostomy, but they did two things. A tracheostomy bypasses body's natural mechanism for warming what you inspire. You inspire gases. You breathe through your nose and your mouth, and they both do that for you. And through that mechanism, what you breathe in reaches body temperature. Well, when you have a tracheotomy performed and a tracheostomy, it's bypassed it. It goes straight in here to the trachea, and you have to artificially recreate the moisture and the warmth. Well, Elizabeth had it until they labelled her profoundly disabled, and then they removed it from her. So she then started to struggle because your body, when it's faced with cold and dry gases, starts to create, as a physiological response, it creates thick, sticky secretions. So she started to constantly suffocate. The tube was constantly blocking. She was constantly being suctioned. And they also said, well, we're going to put her on 2 opiates as well because she's profoundly disabled.
And so opiates, chemo, tracheotomy, all at the age of 4 weeks.
Well, no, the tracheotomy was at 3 months old. The chemo was at 4 weeks old. And then at 6 months old, they prescribed regularly 2 forms of opiates. One of which
she'd never cried again. She never let out that she was ever in pain because she couldn't. But they gave her opioids even though she couldn't tell you.
And one of them wasn't even licensed for a young baby. It still isn't. And they took away the warmth. So she was now struggling. People were having to constantly suction this tube. And they said she wasn't going to have any antibiotics because she was finally disabled and she was never going to develop. And then suddenly, while we weren't on the ward, they gave her antibiotics because she got an infection. And we were told they couldn't risk her leaving the ward or dying before she left the ward because the amount of time she'd been there, their statistics would look bad. And I couldn't believe it. But after she died, someone told us about a program called Bodies, a BBC Three program. And in that's exactly what they were doing. They were intent on getting someone out of their ward still alive, so that if she died, it was someone else's statistic because she'd had all these months of money spent on her. And when I saw that in a drama, I thought these things happen. So she got dumped on a general neurological ward,
a baby.
And then they didn't have staff that could look after a tracheostomy. So she was constantly in danger of suffocating with the tube blocking, and people didn't recognise it. A lot of people started writing concerns that she needed warmth, why it had been taken off her, is critical. Freezing cold compressed oxygen was being delivered 24 hours to the tube and to her trachea. And what I didn't know in addition was that the plastic tracheostomy tube she had was the worst type of tube she could have with all these thick secretions, because everything just got trapped on the plastic and it didn't.
So it is literally like the worst that they could possibly do, they did.
Yeah, they did. And then we were labelled bad parents because we were asking questions and we wanted some kind of continuity of safety of Elizabeth. We hadn't been there 5 minutes when something happened to a little boy called David Stocker, who was 9, and I could see what was going on because my daughter was in a cubicle with a big glass between it and this open bit of the ward, and something happened to him and he got transferred to intensive care. And I saw his mother with his father. His father was distraught. His mother just wasn't bothered. And then I saw her down in the shop laughing and giggling and buying sweets and questionings. So I actually alerted the staff on the neurological ward. And I said, something's not right here. Well, 2 days later, that boy was let go because his mother had been spiking his milk with saline, and she killed him with sodium with saline. And sodium with salt. And the awful thing was that 5 months before she did that, we had raised concerns about the haphazard way that they stored milk feed on the neonatal intensive care unit. And instead of making improvements, they just dumped it everywhere. No one ever knew when or what had come up from the milk feed kitchen, including my own daughter's milk. And they'd find it at the end of the day. It would come up frozen and be defrosted, and anyone could have infiltrated it. And when we complained, they did nothing. We just got a letter from the legal department at Great Ormond Street. 5 months later, this boy's dead. And I was actually spoken to by the Metropolitan Police. And after my own daughter was killed, it wasn't Hampshire Police that came to see me. No one came to see me from the police about my daughter. The Metropolitan Police came out to see me. A few months after Elizabeth died, they came to our house and asked me about what I knew about the death of this boy. But no one was caring about my own child. So that was a nightmare. The ward was
That's
shut.
horrendous.
The ward was shut down, apart from my daughter, who they said had to stay on the neurological ward, but in a different wing. And we didn't know at that time who'd killed the child, but we realised he'd been killed. And my daughter was left all on her own with 2 nurses on empty ward. And we were scared stiff for her because we didn't actually know at that point who'd done what.
And when was this? What year?
That was 2001. So Graham, my husband, said, that's it, this place isn't safe. And he asked me to bundle Elizabeth up. And it's written in the notes that he did, in the nurse's notes, but it was referred to a social worker who made an emergency referral in the night to Camden Social Services that I was a threat to my child. This is a child who a few months later would be killed. And
we all know
I didn't
social
know.
services have a quota, don't we?
Yeah, but my husband and I were trying to keep our child safe in a situation where she was not safe. It was totally out of control and totally abusive. In that, and then one day we arrived on the ward, or we went to go to the ward, and there was a chain on it, and the ward was locked up with and we found out that our daughter had been transferred to another ward because they didn't have 2 nurses to be with her on the neurological ward, but no one had told us. And they retrospectively wrote notes claiming they had told us. We thought she was dead. It was traumatic. It was totally traumatic. And when we did complain that it wasn't safe, they put a guard on the ward. All I ever did was try and safeguard my child. And instead of them doing the same, they just
treating you like a
us
criminal.
like a criminal. And then it was agreed she'd be transferred to a children's hospice because our local hospital wouldn't take her back because they'd get sued if something went wrong. And little did I know something had gone wrong when she was born. So she went to a children's hospice who were funded by the NHS. And
Naomi House.
Yeah, they raised concerns about the lack of warmth. They contacted the community paediatric NHS nursing team. They said the tube's been changed 3 times in a week with suctioning constantly. We've got through 600 suction catheters. Nothing was done. 600 suction catheters of suctioning in a week on my tiny baby. And then they ran out of suction catheters, and the ones supplied by the NHS in the community didn't have graduated markers on them. So the staff at the hospice had no idea how far they were inserting suction catheters to suction my child every 15 minutes. And they were bringing up blood because they were cutting into her own flesh in her trachea. So I rang up the community nursing team, and it's in their records. They told me they couldn't justify the cost of graduated markers on suction catheters. So then I took the emergency suction catheter, stuck it on an A4 piece of paper and put it behind my daughter the rest of her life in the hope that people would not cut into her constantly, but they did. And the whole thing was horrific. And then
I can't even begin to imagine how heavy your heart must have been throughout that period.
It was totally, I was constantly doing my best to safeguard my child in a system that gave me no rights to be listened to, no rights to raise concerns and have them looked into. She was no longer my child. As soon as I had consented to that delivery, she wasn't mine for the rest of her life. From that moment till she died, she was under NHS funded care. And I raised concerns about the staff they were going to employ to look after at home. They were joking about their abilities. And then she came home and the hospice had already raised the dosages of the opiates 4-fold. She wasn't dying. They'd raised them 4-fold, including the unlicensed drug, to massive doses, even for an adult. But they'd done it gradually. And then they were asked to provide a list for our own GP of the drugs. And a doctor at the hospice had not realised, had made a mistake, and she'd merged the two different opiates into one drug. And she was a GP when she wasn't working privately for the hospice. And she realised what she'd done after it was typed up. So she then tried to alter it, but she still didn't make it clear. So our GP thought my daughter had one drug in two different ways. And when they asked for another drug to be prescribed from the hospice, the GP sent a bottle of the unlicensed drug in a massive dose, 25 milligrams 8 hourly, and no one noticed until she got home. And a nurse at home did notice the first night. I took the bottle up to Michelle Sinclair at the GP practice, Elizabeth's GP, and she refused to alter the label on the bottle. She sent me round to the chemist, to Churchill chemist. They said they couldn't, and I had to bring the bottle home. Our GP never even visited Elizabeth. She never drew up a drug chart. And if my daughter hadn't died, we might have finally had a drug chart, proper drug chart, but she died within 6.5 days because nurses wrote their own charts out, and another nurse had written morphine sulfate to be given at 2 o'clock in the morning, 25 milligrams. Well, the wrongly prescribed drug had a label on it, not the brand name of the drug, but morphine sulfate, 25 milligrams. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, a nurse called Joyce gave Elizabeth 25 milligrams of an unlicensed drug, which would kill an adult. And she started to suffocate at 4 a.m. and the nurse just ignored her. She's altered any records that weren't on a separate sheet. She's altered, and you can see she has. Her writing's changed, the number of words in a line has changed, but she couldn't change anything which had been on a sheet where a nurse the night before had written. But everything else has been rewritten. And Elizabeth suffocated in front of her because she had no idea what was going on. She had no idea she'd given an overdose. She had no idea that the signs of my daughter suffocating were restlessness and wheeziness, any trachea patient. She recorded it was happening and left my daughter to die in my home. And my daughter was dead, and then no one investigated. Every single point in the chain where things have been done differently, the outcome would be different, has been covered up.
Chris, I just want to add in here, at no point did that nurse call an ambulance. And we think that Elizabeth died around 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Whilst Anne and Graham were asleep in their bed, their daughter was dying.
Okay.
And the nurse brought her body to the door and said, "I'm sorry, she's gone," at around 7 a.m.
Well, she said, "Oh my God, Lizzie, oh my God, Lizzie." She didn't even know what she'd done. She didn't even know. Bill Kirkup said to us the day before he published his report, if we spoke out, we'd be labelled racists. She was an immigrant, and I embrace immigrants, but she didn't need the job. She already was a multi-property owner. She was in the UK on a Nigerian passport, and she needed a visa to stay here. So she chopped and changed visas. That's why she trained as a nurse at the age of 47. She was a fully qualified French teacher with a French degree and a postgraduate teaching qualification, but she couldn't do that in the UK. And she had family in America, and she wanted to move to America. She couldn't live in America just on the back of a Nigerian passport, but she could live in the UK, get the right to remain in the UK, and then move to America. I mean, when she was training, she was a multi-property owner. We discovered it. The land registry helped us, BT helped us, failings in data protection by the NMC helped us, because we received paperwork, none of which we should have received, but had 2 different addresses for her. And then with the help of BT, we found another one, and the land registry told us she owned all of them when she was training as a nurse. And that's just what we know about. She had no reason to come to our house. She didn't know about tracheostomies. The overdose is the fault of the GP, not doing a drug chart, not altering the label on the bottle. And Bill Kirkup has come along, covered it all up. He came to see us. We'd had a letter from Jeremy Hunt convincing us to trust Bill Kirkup. And Bill Kirkup came to the house. He said he wouldn't have been appointed by Jeremy Hunt if he hadn't wanted the maximum exposed. And then he just laughed in our face because he said he was involved with drafting the letter we got from the Department of Health. So the man that did this to us was involved in drafting a letter which was meant to convince us the investigation would be honest. And we tape recorded the meeting. And he said he wouldn't sweep the truth under the carpet. He was shocked that people cover up, and he'd seen it before, and it was very sad, and institutions aren't interested in learning. And he sat there and he said he would do a hard-hitting report, and you needed to point out the different points of the chain needed to be reported on, that if things had been done differently, the outcome would be different. And he said he was good at it, and he expected about 90% to be in the report. And he literally sat in our house where our daughter died and said, could he have a deal on that? I have it on tape. Could he have a deal that 90% would be in the report?
I've heard the recording.
90% would be in the report. And I said, well, yes, providing the 10% isn't everything touching on criminality. And then he replied, well, it wouldn't be 10% then, would it? And he asked us to hand over all our evidence. The second time I had a meeting with him, I only ever had 2 meetings, despite the lies in the report. The second time I had a meeting was 18 months later. We'd had an email from his head of secretariat, a former colleague of his at the Department of Health. She said, this time for your evidence session. It was a short period of time, 2 hours for 355 days of life. And I complained it was too short. She then said, well, everyone's gone through everything. We all know what happened. And then she said, oh, you're not having an evidence session at all. So we went to London, and I did my best to give some evidence. And Bill Kirkup stopped us. He said it wouldn't be independent if we gave evidence. If I'd given evidence, it would have been formally documented and transcribed, which is exactly what he did in East Kent maternity. And I would have been saying something completely different to what he's published through Parliament. And he would not have got parliamentary privilege. And time went on, and I got concerned, and I texted him because he wasn't answering the phone anymore. And I said, I don't believe the truth's going to come out. I don't think this media coverage is a good idea. And I think we're going to be in a worse position than we were before. And he texted me that I wasn't to go out in public with what I expected the findings of the report to be. Because just like my witness testimony, I'd have been telling the truth. He never took statements from us. He never transcribed anything, which would have been a formal record of the truth. Hampshire Police never interviewed Graham and me about what happened to Elizabeth. They never took witness statements. People like James Titcombe, he had a witness statement taken by the police. He was interviewed by the police. The families in East Kent, they were filmed giving evidence. And then the summary was sent to them of what they'd said. Whilst he was covering up what was going on to our daughter, he conned us. He had the backing of a journalist called Sean Linton, who I'd been raising concerns about ever since someone first got in contact with him about Elizabeth. And I kept giving him the benefit of the doubt, but I kept wondering if it was right that he was involved. And I did in the end. I sent him an email in August 2015 raising my concerns. And he was just like, he came back indignantly that he was really upset. And look what's happened. Look what's happened. And before Bill Kirkup got appointed, they put Peter Hutton in. And Peter Hutton sent a transparency document through NHS Improvement that he was giving all his possible conflicts of interest. But he failed to mention that his business partner was the ex-medical director of the company commissioned by the NHS to provide care for Elizabeth. And he also failed to mention that the reason why we never had an investigation previously in 2014 was because he was going to be doing it with his business partner. And his business partner said, well, I can't because I used to be the medical director of Prime Care. Nowhere on that transparency document from Mike Durkin, director in NHS Improvement, from his office, does it say that. And we found out the truth. And then this man, Peter Hutton, said we didn't trust him, and we were vengeful parents. And then the journalist Sean Linton went mad because Peter Hutton pulled out. And then he sent me an email with a suggested apology for me to send to Peter Hutton and Mike Durkin of NHS Improvement. They're total crooks. Why would you put someone in a second time when you know that your business partner in FH Partnerships is Tony Felton, the ex-medical director of Prime Care, the company commissioned to look after my daughter? And why would you not say, oh, by the way, I was going to do it in 2014? The reason why you never had an investigation then was because My business partner pulled out, and we were all worried you'd find out who my business partner was. I mean, they went to extremes. I looked at FH partnerships and I found people's bios on there, apart from Tony Felton's. So anyway, I was asked to apologise, so I did. And then
Imagine apologising. Imagine making.
Peter Hutton then said he'd think about it. He then came back on, he said he'd be chair. And then he would email me and copy in the journalist. I never thought this was right. I've got proof at the time. I thought this is all wrong. Journalists knew Peter Hutton was appointed before we did. He knew about Bill Kirkup, knew we were going to get a letter from Jeremy Hunt. And then Peter Hutton sent an email saying, how would we feel if 70% was in the report? So, of course, 90% felt better, didn't it? But nothing's in the report. All those points in the chain.
Just psychological games that were there.
It's psychological game, and he's put it in Parliament. He's got parliamentary privilege from it. And if I'd gone out in public with what I expected the findings to be, he would not have parliamentary privilege because I would be speaking the truth, and it's not in the report. If they'd done a statement from us, if we'd been official witness to an investigation into my own daughter, we'd have been telling the truth because everybody knew that I'd worked it out. And then I contacted Ted Baker, who used to be Chief Inspector of Hospitals. I told him everything. I was totally traumatized. And he said, well, you were a threat. The truth was a threat. How can the truth about how they treat babies, mothers, maternity cover-ups, pediatric cover-ups, disabled babies, innocent, disabled, helpless babies. How can that be a threat? You should be wanting to learn.
Because the establishment is evil and corrupt.
Evil. I mean, the man is a sociopath. He's in my house grooming us to trust him and hand over all the evidence and step back. You know, totally evil. People think he's wonderful out there. James Tipcombe knows the truth. But he didn't care less. He still did a blog for the British Medical Journal praising it. These people don't care. This is what I mean about people. Yes, you can be bereaved. You can have lost a child. You can have a disabled child. You can work as a director in NHS improvement. You can be some minister. It doesn't matter what your title is or what happened to you. You either have integrity or you don't. And Bill Kirkup was sent in to finally shut us down, to silence us, to silence the threat, because I have found out the truth about my daughter and what they'd done to her, what they put her through. I found it out. It took me years. I had support from abroad, and then because I knew the truth, I had to be silenced. And the only way they could do it was put someone in to write a pack of lies, get it in Parliament before I knew what had hit me. That evening, I saw the report. I never saw a draft. I only ever had 2 meetings with him. I was never a witness. And I saw the report and I tried to speak to him. And he didn't speak to me. And I said, oh my God, what have you done to us? What have we been a part of? He'd done his job. What's that other lady? Donna Rockenden? Rhiannon Davis had contacted her before the report came out because I was so concerned because, I hadn't been a witness or anything. And Donna Rockenden said she was concerned about the fact we hadn't been involved, we hadn't had a voice. But I was asked to speak to her, which I did before the report came out. And she went on the phone to me. She was cold and completely different. And then when the report came out and I was totally traumatized, Rhiannon contacted her, and a message came back from NHS England from a guy called Adrian Fowler that Bill Kirkup said he'd done his tasking and he wasn't going to help me get any mental health support. And I was just suicidal, wasn't I? And then I was told not to speak to Rhiannon anymore, who told me, to release the pressure I was under and the trauma by going and kicking a dog. I mean, if she'd been through what I'd been through, I'm sure she wouldn't be so flippant. She lost a child, and I really grieve for that. But her child died at 6 hours old, and people were honest. My child lived for 355 days of abuse and neglect because people were dishonest. And when she came back into the community, she was put under the safety of a man involved in what happened with the brain injury and covering it up. And he was designated doctor for child safety. That's not in the report. He was
like
designated
asking Jimmy
doctor
Savile
for
to
child
babysit.
safety.
What did you just say there, Chris?
I said that's like asking Jimmy Savile to babysit.
Well, would you like to know who investigated some of Jimmy Savile's stuff?
Bill Kirkup.
Bill Kirkup.
Bill Kirkup and Andrula Johnson, who'd been involved in putting together my daughter's NHS funded care package and ensuring it was safe. Andrula Johnson did it with Bill Kirkup. So
The problem
how
is
are you spelling that last name?
Kirkup,
Yeah.
Kirkup. Now, Chris, Kirkup. When I was a student midwife,
Yeah.
Bill Kirkup and Rob Francis. So Rob Francis had done the mid-staffs inquiry, and Bill Kirkup did Morecambe Bay. In my essays, I would write about these amazing men and all they did, and they would be weaved through all of my essays as these prominent, incredible men that tried to save mums and babies' lives. So I didn't know any different. But when I met Anne 8 weeks ago, and she's weaving in the names that I know, such as James Titcombe, Donna Ockenden, Rhiannon Davies, Bill Kirkup, knowing all these people, I'm thinking there's something really fundamentally wrong. And I'm going to tell you everything that Anna said. She has got either an email, a document, a dictaphone recording, which she's backed up multiple times to uncover this whole story of Lizzie's death.
Yes. Dr. Tettenborn was designated Doctor for Child Safety. He was used all the time by the police in their investigations, and yet I only found out years after the police allegedly investigated and after an inquest, which said that my daughter was born incompatible with human life and didn't deserve a neglect verdict. And then I found out who Dr. Tettenborn was, and I tried to complain. I was then the subject of social services saying I was a child abuser. Then I was arrested by the police. And then I finally got to meet the CEO of Frimley Park, Andrew Morris, with Karen Roberts, the PALS manager, and also a paediatrician who we subsequently found out had lied in an internal review before I met Andrew Morris. Karen Roberts had tried to report this man, but he carried on being head of neonatology for years. But Andrew Morris said that Dr. Tettenborn was the port of entry into the police process whenever they had concerns about a child. If a child got harmed or died, well, Dr. Tettenborn knew my daughter had suffocated and had had a massive overdose of an unlicensed drug, and he didn't call the police. And he also knew she'd been brain damaged at 4 days old. He was put into the care package to ensure Elizabeth was safe. There were emails I got years later showing it. He was responsible medical officer, responsible for changes to medication. I was literally handing my daughter back to someone who knew that a Frimley Park, under his and other doctors' care, had suffered massive brain injuries that I knew nothing about. I was giving her back to a man that would never want me to know, otherwise they wouldn't have hidden it in the first place. And so he was warned she wasn't safe and he didn't do a thing about her. And he arrived in A&E, and in the report it says he was on call. Well, both Karen Roberts and the CEO, Andrew Morris, said, they can't understand why he came there. He was a community paediatrician.
How did he know she died?
Well, they think that the care company, Prime Care, had probably told him. He turned up and drove us home knowing she'd suffocated. Knowing she'd suffocated. He's lied throughout the report. He said there would have been a crime with the confirmation certificate if it had been completed when Dr. Tettenborn knew that there was no investigation going on. He stopped the investigation. He's the trusted man for children's deaths for the coroner. He stopped it. By a day after she died, we'd been convinced that there was no need for a post-mortem. And we had the blocked trachea tube. We knew nothing about the drug overdose. There were lots of people that did. And she was cremated. And the cremation certificates are falsified to get her through to the crematorium. The cremation certificate, the initial one, was completed the day she died. Graham and I barely understood she was dead, and someone was saying,
Did she even get a birth certificate?
She did get a birth certificate, which was.
They also lied on her death certificate where she died. They said she died in the hospital and she died at home.
When she arrived at the hospital, she'd been dead throughout the trip to the hospital, and the junior doctor that received her body wrote in the records that Elizabeth was very cold. She'd been dead hours. And now he's covered it all up made sure nothing's in the report, and said, oh, the nurse fell asleep. Nothing about the GP, the drug chart, the drug overdose. She had an entire week to save my child. Nothing about the lies in the summary, omitting what really happened at Frimley. The report says my daughter was hypoxic and I delayed the birth. Well, I've had two obstetric whistleblowers, one called Mark and one called Martin Pittman, Mark and Martin, who both looked at the records and said they wouldn't have delivered my child, that there was no need to deliver her. She wasn't hypoxic, she wasn't anemic.
I'm not a doctor, and looking at these CTGs, there's no way. I mean, I would have called a doctor to review, but there's no way they would have sectioned a mother in the last 10 years that I've been a midwife and student midwife. There's no way they would have sectioned.
Would you put this down as more? Would you say it was more deliberate than?
I picked up on something, Chris, since Anne's been talking. Anne has told me that after Elizabeth died, she received a letter saying that they wanted more tissue samples from Elizabeth and she'd been used in research, which makes me wonder, did they recognise something on the scan that they would potentially have seen as a research project?
I think they did in Great Ormond. In the scans, they just ignored them. Neuroblastoma can be identified in pregnancy, and it's been known about for donkey's years. And they used to actually screen babies' urine when they were born to check for neuroblastoma. But they stopped doing it because if it came up with neuroblastoma, they'd treat the baby, and they realised the treatment was causing more damage than neuroblastoma would. Because a neonatal neuroblastoma is not, I may well have the remains of a neuroblastoma in me. You may well have it, but it never caused an issue. When she was inside me, she was safe and I was looking after her. When she wrongly came out at that time, they put all their effort in to covering up. And I'm so betrayed. I can't imagine the heinousness of a man coming to our house, conning us, disappearing. Nearly 4 years we waited for that report to be published, and then saying we couldn't see the report before it was published. We were excluded from his press conference, and God knows what was said there. I mean, this is how they do it. So you get families that say, I've got an MBE, I think he's wonderful, or Donna Ockenden has given me years of psychotherapy, privately funded by the NHS, but private. And then you get people like me. I've just been trying to live and trying to assist all these years, wondering why people were attacking me as I found things out, until I realised who Dr. Tettenborn was. But, Chris, they didn't even get him to resign. He carried on. He carried on working. At the inquest, he talked with the coroner and they agreed he was retired. He wasn't. He was now, the role of designated doctor was now split into live children and dead children. And he had the senior role in Hampshire and Isle of Wight for dead children. The coroner was on the committee that handled that. The police officer on it, and they all knew who he was. And he wasn't retired and at all. In fact, he'd become director of paediatrics, clinical director at Frinley Park. He'd come into the community between 2008 2010, he had that role, but at the inquest in December 2008, he was retired. The whole thing was a setup. The coroner was a solicitor who'd worked as a partner in public law children's work. The assistant coroner is also in the same. She's still working as both roles, but she is, well, definitely as assistant coroner, but she was a partner in the same law firm as him. This whole thing, they weren't interested in learning.
This whole thing sounds a bit
in saving anyone.
It all sounds a bit secret handshake-ish.
It's all corrupt. It's totally and utterly corrupt. The only good thing that's come out of it is that the current license holders for the drug overdose, they have done a report and put it in the European Medicines Agency and actually passed it to the UK MHRA, the Medicines Health Regulatory Authority. And the report says that my daughter was 150 days on an unlicensed drug. Due to incorrect labelling, she was killed. It was fatal. And that's the truth, but you won't see any of that in the report whatsoever. You'll see, a nurse got confused, a nurse fell asleep. She's a victim. She used the system to keep getting visas to get her right to remain, to move to America. She was from one of the richest families in Nigeria. Her brother was the first Black director of Shell, Nigeria. Her brother went to boarding school in England. Her father had been to Cambridge, and this was a very wealthy family, but she had families that lived in America, and she's moved to America. She's
And
now
this is what makes me think this is why I get like red flags with this lady, because she just seems like the least kind of, I don't know, you wouldn't expect somebody like that in that background to do what she's doing when she doesn't need to do it. Nursing is
And
usually a vocation.
Wow.
yes, and Justine Winter, the whistleblowing nurse from Wales, has uncovered rogue nursing in Ivor Bevan, where she's putting it through an employment tribunal, which they've withdrawn 3 times. She's on her fourth and final application on the 22nd of October in Cardiff. We're all going. And they've just asked her to submit her bundle for the last time, and they gave her the wrong address, which meant if she'd followed through with that, she would have been out of time. Oddly, her car needed new tyres, so she thought, I'm in Cardiff, I'll drop it off. When she got there, the court said, we've never heard of this address, and we don't know who you're talking about. So she uncovered rogue nurses. So was this the beginning of rogue nursing? Now, I just want Anne to touch upon the story of Paul Collins.
Yeah, I will touch
Joyce.
upon that. But Joyce used a false reference to go and work for an agency when she was working under a work permit for the NHS. And we proved it all. We had help of Font Online, a local graphic designer. We even had help of someone within the care company who actually sent us some documents. So we knew what system they used. They used Apple Mac. We had help of Apple. And I proved it all. She used a false reference. She pretended she'd been a student at Bradford College. So I guess she had a false application for that because she couldn't stay in the country and do nothing. She had to have some kind of visa. And it was a friend of hers, and Bradford College confirmed she was never a student there. When we found out Bill Kirkup was covering all that up, he said, well, it doesn't matter. What matters is whether she could do the job or not. Well, she couldn't do the job, because she couldn't recognise my daughter was suffocating. You can't blame her for the drug overdose. That's the GP and the health visitor and all that negligence there. But she didn't recognise my daughter was suffocating at 4 a.m. in my house, feet away from me. My daughter died. I wasn't even with her when she died. I've been robbed of her death. I've been lied about. 350 days of life has been covered up. Her whole life was neglect, negligence, abuse under the NHS, coerced, uninformed consent all her life. She was not mine. She was the NHS's. And when you cover up everything they did to her and all the failings and everything, you take away my daughter from me. He's literally stolen my daughter. He said he was calling it Catalyst for Change. He's got this big heading which says 20-year cover-up. People were willfully dishonest, fabricated facts and ignored others. And then he went on to do exactly that. Hidden in plain sight in a report laid in Parliament is a pack of lies. But another family he did an investigation for say he's lovely and honest and so kind. He went down to Swansea to show them the draft report. I saw the report hours after the press had gone. Press didn't care we hadn't seen the report. They all think he's wonderful. It's
and Anne's report was published the same day that Matt Hancock published the tier system in COVID. So you would never have seen Anne's story hidden behind.
Well, everything crashed. But no one came to us after, so I wasn't asked to speak because everyone knew what he'd done. No one wasn't asked for my input in anything to make anything safer. But Paul Collins was the senior nurse manager at Prime Care. He joined Prime Care in April.
Remind the people who Prime Care.
Prime Care were the care company commissioned to look after my daughter, but they used agency nurses. Any of the back, all of them were agency nurses, including Joyce. There was no visa or working for Prime Care. I bought their company accounts. I did everything, so I know exactly how everything operated. And he was the senior nurse manager. He got the job and started in April 2001. By November, he'd applied for a job in Ireland. It had a closing date of the 30th of November. He was going to work as assistant director of nursing at the orthopaedic hospital in Dublin. And no, he was going to work at the Children's Hospital in Dublin initially. That's where he went initially. So before we had an inquest, he contacted us out of the blue and he said he'd been scapegoated and the fact that he'd made up his mind to leave and he tried to raise concerns with the medical director, then medical director, and he'd left. And I contacted the police and they said they'd send someone round. No one came round. So I emailed DC Neil Cousin and he didn't do anything. And obviously I proved everything. He had applied for a job elsewhere and he said my child wasn't the only child at risk. And he'd been scapegoated when Elizabeth died and it destroyed his life. He did move to Ireland. He did get the job. But then sort of a couple of years later, things kicked off with the NMC because we'd written to them, to ask what's gone on. Anybody that knows anything about trackies knows our daughter was suffocating 4 a.m. We need answers. We sent it everywhere, this report. We went everywhere, even went to Dr. Tettenborn. It went to the Health Authority. And people lied about him. All people, the hospice manager lied about him, said she had this long meeting with him face to face. When I got the records from the hospice, you could see it was a nurse manager called Sue Ward that came to the hospice, but he was everybody's poor guy, and it destroyed his life because the NMC went after him, and it destroyed his marriage, and it broke up, it destroyed his career. And he moved back to Scotland. He broke up with his wife, left her and the children in Ireland. And I told Dr. Kirkhart, Bill Kirkhart, where he was. And in Scotland, he'd gone back to working for the NHS, actually, in Midlothian, because I saw an advert and he was the contact for it. And I rang him up and it was his voice. And I should have spoken to him. I wish I had. But when the report came out, it cast doubt on him. So his responsibility for Elizabeth's death, he was entirely innocent. And I had a massive breakdown. Even though I have another child, I was completely suicidal, tempted to take my own life because I was completely traumatized several times. And then suddenly I thought, well, what about Paul Collins? If I'm broken, he'll be broken. And I searched online and I found an obituary in Ireland and then an obituary in Edinburgh. And he died very suddenly, very unexpectedly. And he died 4 weeks after the report came out. And when it was finally, finished and there was a full, proper death certificate, he'd taken a mixed drug overdose. Now, I don't know why or how that happened, but this was 4 weeks after that report came out. The man I discovered was entirely innocent and he'd been scapegoated. He'd reassured us about the nurse when he came to visit us while the care package was going on, but he said he hadn't known directly, he wasn't directly involved. The nurse managers did it, and he oversaw the scene, the nurse managers themselves. And everything he said was right. He applied for a job, which we had a closing date 4 days before Elizabeth died. He was barely in the company 5 minutes before he left. And it all made sense. And I investigated everything. I handed everything over to Bill Kirkhart. So the Department of Health, everybody knows all the evidence we've got. And then he wrote a pack of lies with sanction by whoever, checked by goodness knows who, laid in Parliament, and he walked away. And when I tried to speak to him, he wouldn't talk to me. So I spoke to his head of secretariat. She used to be a whistleblower guardian at Guy's and St Thomas's. She worked in complaints at Guy's and St Thomas's. She talks about safeguarding. And I talked to her, and then we tape recorded the call in the end because we were so shocked that she even answered what she was saying. And basically, she said he didn't have to write the truth. He was independent. He had to think of public interest and what went in a public report. So he chose what he wrote. She admitted what the GP did and said it was a bad mistake. It killed my daughter. It killed my daughter. And on the phone, she's calling it a bad mistake and saying that we wanted every little thing. And there was a yawning gap between our expectations and what he chose to write. And that's what she said. And then I phoned him up using someone else's phone 8 months later. And he said, this isn't going to end well. I'm completely honest, and put the phone down on me. He didn't give a shit whether Graham killed himself, I killed myself, what happened to our other child, or what happens to any other parent that doesn't know what's going on in the NHS. There must be an immediate review, an honest review of all maternity at Frimley, of the work of Jane Coburn, of the work of safeguarding in not just in the hospital, but in the community, of social services, of any police investigation he was ever part of. And there needs to be a review of paediatrics as well. In fact, I think they should do it in every hospital in the country. It's an absolute disgrace, a total disgrace that they cover up and ignore you. They get your baby out with no reason. They then damage your baby and hide that. They lie to another hospital. They didn't care what abuse happened to my daughter in that other hospital, as long as they kept everything covered up. They really do not care. They get a few people who've got simple cases where they can afford to have the truth out. They make campaigners. They give them a platform. They give them support. They give them compensation. They give them compensation, don't they?
What you find, Chris, is the Nursing and Midwifery Council, which is the governing body of nurses and midwives, particularly for the gentleman that died of the drug overdose, is the same governing body as Lucy Letby. It's the same governing body. So you've got to think, right? I've been called a baby killer, as you well know. I'm unraveling that story. The Nursing and Midwifery Council will not act against me, but I've been called a baby killer because I'm too big a platform, and they know that there's a lie raveled in it somewhere. And then you've got me telling the Nursing and Midwifery Council that patients aren't safe, and I'm writing to them in the CQC. And now you've got 6 whistleblower nurses and midwives in my little group. We've all done the same thing in 6 different hospitals, and we've all had threats, and we've all lost our jobs. And this is embedded and is multifaceted to the point that it's so hard to unravel it. But when you say what Anne has just said, the truth of the matter is that Elizabeth's death was covered up, and that these men and women who are involved in all of this are online sharing all these amazing parent stories. And Anne Dixon has been buried at the very base of this whole corruption that has gone on for 25 years. And that is why when I met Anne, I wanted to sit with her and learn every bit of detail since June, which I've done. I've read, I've listened, I've watched, I've cried a lot.
You did? You did. My husband's blind, and we had this Zoom thing with her, so my husband couldn't see, but you were just weeping at what they did at the beginning to Elizabeth, because you've got empathy. The problem is a lot of people can be parents, they can be doctors, but they just don't have empathy and they don't have integrity. His task was to finally shut us down once and for all, get the press to celebrate it, and we would be left. And I have been left, and we only randomly came into contact, didn't we? And it's just horrendous what's going on, the amount of money that's spent on covering up.
Some people are just soulless. That's the trouble. There's just people who are demonic in the heart. And it seems to be those people that get cherry picked.
Exactly. And I want to thank you for just giving Anne that voice and that platform, because we know in the truth movement, in the truth across my story has been able to expand quicker by being outside the mainstream media. I've noticed that. It's gone like that. And Anne now needs to not rely on and use the very people that have dug her own grave in all of this.
None of them cared that I hadn't been a witness, that I hadn't seen the report. They just praised Bill Kirkup, and then I saw it. But this is crazy. This is no way to treat people. Truth should be wanted. I mean, I've got learning now in the European Medicines Agency because they cared. They cared. The license holders wanted to do something to try and help safeguard someone in the future. And they did that, but everything else just covered up. And people think he's a wonderful man. God knows what he's covered up at. God knows what it's been covered up at mid-staffs. Pete Hunt was at mid-staffs. This is a man that's pretending he's being transparent, was hiding the biggest elephant in the room possible and going to great lengths to hide it. I mean, I guess they wanted him for the same reason they ended up putting Bill Kirkup in. What is the point in wasting money on these things if you're never going to learn anything? And just, letting a few people get their inquest, they get the legal covered, they get psychological support. I have not.
What would you like if somebody said, right, you can have anything you want? What would you like now? Would it be funding so you can take these bastards to court? Would it be some kind of retribution? What would you?
What I would like is report removed from the Department of Health's website. I would like it formally noted in Parliament, and I would like statutory inquiry with me as an official witness and Graham as an official witness. I mean, in Northern Ireland, they're on mission under Paul Frew, who's a member of the Assembly of Northern Ireland. He is doing a private members bill to bring in an individual statutory legal duty of candour for people to be honest in healthcare. And he's spoken to me, and that needs to be investigators too and report writers. They paid all sorts of dirty tricks to shut us down. And he's got the support of every party in Northern Ireland, but they're not doing it here. We need an individual statutory duty of candour. That's been pushed for by the father of Robbie Powell for decades, has been pushing for that. I've been asking for that. And yet someone come along, come into my house, come into my car. I mean, I did everything I could to make the people that did all the photocopying, scanning, welcome, and they've conned me and walked away. The only learning has come from me with the license holder in Germany, Glenwood in Germany, and they were absolutely lovely.
I have got an appointment in 20 minutes.
Right, so we better go.
I don't want to be rude and step in, but I know that this story isn't over.
Okay.
No. I want that report to go. I want an inquiry that we're witnesses in, and I want learning. I want learning to come from it. I don't want anyone else to find out years later that they've been conned and then get conned again and conned again. People like Bill Kirkhart and Peter Hutton should not be doing these investigations. They should have people like me with integrity on them, who pick doctors of integrity to work on, because obviously I'm not medically trained and I'm not a nurse. That's what they should have. The people should be doing it. You can't trust these people, and you shouldn't be treating some people to honesty and fating them and giving them all the mental health support whilst leaving somebody else suicidal at buying petrol and a lighter. That shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, it's evil. It's
anyway,
evil.
But thank you.
Yes, you're more than welcome, and I'm happy to leave that here. Well, I say happy to leave that here, but we can always come back. We can always update.
We will be back.
Well, and I will have a quick chat with you before I go. But for now, I'll just say bye to everyone who's watching this. So I hope I don't want to say enjoyed it, but I hope you've learned from it. I hope.
Yeah.
Well, I don't really know what to say because it's quite
I think it's for us.
a heavy talk.
Thank
you
not
at all.
For giving people
absolutely.
a platform to get the truth out. Let's get this country sorted out, and people like you do that.
So people, please share the video. This video, I know there's other videos going to come out. Share those as well if you get the chance to see them. But look after yourselves, take care, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye for now.